Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're embarking on a journey not just to the highest place on Earth, but into a realm beyond human comprehension, a place that simultaneously offers the ultimate triumph and enacts the ultimate betrayal. This is a mystery rooted in physics, money, and the darkest ethical failure of modern exploration. We are talking about Mount Everest, and tonight we are focusing on the silent, frozen population left behind on its slopes. So before we fully dive into this deep psychological puzzle, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Your support truly helps. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. Now, settle in and let the cold preserve this story in your mind. This is the ultimate cold case. Imagine a place where the air itself is an enemy, where the laws of society dissolve, and where death is not just inevitable, but is perfectly preserved. A place where a victim who died 60 years ago looks almost identical to one who died last year. This is the death zone, the vast high-altitude graveyard where more than 200 bodies remain. They are not hidden, many are visible, perfectly preserved by the cold, often serving as mile markers for the living climbers who step around them on their way to the summit. They are the mountain's frozen monuments to failure. The true mystery is not how they got there. We know how they died. The mystery is why they stay. Why is it, in an era of multi-million-dollar expeditions and technological prowess, that we leave our dead exposed for decades at a time? Why is the final debt of the world's most expensive adventure the most macabre? The abandonment of the human body? This is the core question. Does the mountain's dominion end with life, or does it claim eternal ownership over the frozen flesh? We will explore the heartbreaking stories of those left behind, the oldest, the most visible, the most tragic. We will break down the precise logistical, ethical, and financial nightmare that turns a 180-pound human being into an unmovable granite corpse. Chapter 1. The Death Zone. Physics of Fatal Abandonment. The vast majority of bodies left on Mount Everest are entombed in a region of the mountain that has earned a name that is neither technical nor geological, but purely descriptive: the Death Zone. This is the cruel, unyielding realm of Everest, defined as any altitude above 8,000 meters or 26,247 feet. To understand why the bodies are left and why they are preserved, we must first understand this zone. It is a place where human life is not sustained, but actively consumed. The atmospheric physics are simple and devastating. At sea level, the air contains 21% oxygen, delivered at sufficient pressure for your body to absorb it effortlessly. Above 8,000 meters, the pressure drops so severely that the available oxygen is roughly 1/3 of what your body is accustomed to. This physical fact alone dictates every action, decision, and fatality on the upper slopes. In the death zone, a constant, irreversible process of physiological breakdown begins. This is where the human body starts to die. The science of suffocation, hemoglobin, and hypoxia. The critical difference between climbing Everest and climbing a 6,000-meter peak is the inability of the body to acclimatise to the extreme atmospheric pressure above 8,000 meters. The fundamental problem is not the percentage of oxygen, which remains 21%, but the partial pressure of oxygen, which dictates how efficiently oxygen molecules can be forced into the bloodstream. The hemoglobin crisis is immediate. At sea level, your blood oxygen saturation, or peripheral oxygen saturation, is near 100%. At the Everest summit, 8,848 meters, a climber breathing ambient air has a peripheral oxygen saturation that hovers around 58% to 65%. To put this into perspective, any patient in a hospital with a peripheral oxygen saturation below 80% is considered critically ill and requires immediate intervention. The Everest climber is functioning in a sustained state of near death. The hemoglobin in their red blood cells, which is responsible for oxygen transport, is simply unable to carry enough vital gas to sustain basic organ function. The survival clock starts the moment they enter the death zone. Every minute spent above 8,000 metres without supplemental oxygen is effectively depleting the body's life reserves. Even with oxygen, the body is operating at a severe deficit. This is the survival clock, a non-negotiable countdown to metabolic collapse, the unstoppable decline, a physiological nightmare. Within minutes of entering the death zone, the lack of oxygen, or hypoxia, begins to wreak absolute havoc on the human brain and organs. This is the mechanism that ensures the dead remain unretrieved. The pressure exerted by the body's own fluids is no longer balanced by the external atmospheric pressure, leading to the devastating condition known as high-altitude illness, HAI, cognitive collapse, high-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE, is the end stage of acute mountain sickness and the single greatest cause of poor decision-making on the mountain. HACE occurs when the lack of oxygen triggers a massive cerebral vasodilation, essentially causing the blood vessels in the brain to widen in a desperate attempt to gather more air. This leads to intracranial hypertension. The brain swells against the rigid confines of the skull. The ataxic stagger is the first sign, manifesting as severe headache, confusion, and then rapid progression to ataxia, loss of coordination, making walking impossible. The climber loses the ability to walk a straight line or even maintain balance. This stagger is often mistakenly attributed to exhaustion, when it is in fact the brain beginning to fail. We can infer that bodies found far off route were likely victims who experienced a complete loss of spatial awareness and stumbled blindly away from the trail. The sensory shutdown follows. As haste progresses, the brainstem begins to lose function, leading to a breakdown of communication. The climber cannot process visual input correctly, distances become distorted, and their world narrows to a tiny, suffocating point. The famous 20-step mantra, the need to stop and rest every 20 steps, is not a sign of fitness. It is a sign of extreme neurological failure. Every decision, from clipping a safety line to drinking water, requires a tremendous, conscious effort that the failing brain cannot sustain. The philosophical collapse is the most profound. The descent from Everest is a test of will, but haste destroys the will itself. The climber might look at their partner, recognise the danger, and yet lack the cognitive ability to initiate a simple rescue protocol or share a life-saving resource. This is not malice, it is neurological failure, a chilling physical explanation for the ethical abandonment. Paradoxical undressing is the most horrifying symptom of haste. The hypothalamus, the body's core temperature regulator, misfires, giving the victim a profound, often terminal, sensation of overheating just before death. Many bodies are found partially clothed or stripped, a final futile gesture against the cold. Pulmonary failure, high altitude, pulmonary edema or HAPE is the other immediate fatal threat, characterized by fluid build-up in the lungs. HAPE develops due to the body's reaction to low oxygen, where blood vessels constrict, trying to divert blood flow to areas of the lung that are better oxygenated. This process dramatically increases blood pressure in the pulmonary vessels, forcing fluid to leak into the air sacs. The summit cough is the beginning of HAPE, often so violent that climbers often fracture ribs as the body attempts to expel the accumulating fluid. As the condition worsens, the frothy sputum coughed up becomes pink, tinged with blood. The victim is drowning internally, and the only cure is immediate descent. a vertical drop of at least 1,000 meters. HORRIFYING is not a slow killer. It can progress from a mild cough to total respiratory failure within 12 hours if oxygen is not supplied. This speed ensures that once a climber is stricken, any thought of personal rescue is almost immediately rendered impossible. The silent killers, dehydration and metabolic shock, guarantee incapacitation. Climbers in the death zone lose litres of water a day through hyperventilation and heavy sweating under their down suits. Severe dehydration thickens the blood, a measurable phenomenon known as increased hematocrit. This thickening forces the heart to work harder, accelerating the onset of frostbite by reducing peripheral circulation. The process of melting ice for water is so energy intensive that many climbers simply forgo it, accepting the severe dehydration that leads to metabolic shock. The philosophical cost of survival is the sacrifice of basic human needs. The body operates in a state of extreme energy deficit catabolism. By the time a climber reaches the summit, they have burned through almost all their reserves. The body literally starves to death, ensuring that even if a climber survives the hypoxic environment, they lack the physical energy to take a single, self-sustaining step downward. The mystery of preservation, mummification by cold. This brings us to the core mystery. Why do the bodies remain? The answer lies in the unique environment that acts as the world's most unforgiving, high-altitude preservation chamber. The death zone is dominated by three preserving factors. The extreme cold ensures temperatures rarely rise above freezing, halting the enzymatic and bacterial processes of decomposition almost instantly. The body is flash frozen into a rigid stone-like mass. Low humidity and high wind prevail. The intense wind, Hansen, sometimes exceeding 150 miles per hour, causes sublimation, drawing moisture out of the remains. This creates a form of natural mummification where the skin becomes taut, dark and leathery, fusing the corpse to the surrounding ice. This process is so effective that years later, clothing fibres and even facial expressions can remain disturbingly intact. Glacier movement is constant. Many bodies lie encased in glacial ice. This ice acts as a perfectly sealed, protective tomb, preserving clothing, skin, and even organs for decades or centuries, leading to the eerie state of almost perfect preservation observed in some recovered remains. The consequence is terrifyingly poetic. The mountain preserves its victims as eternal silent sentinels. A person who died 70 years ago can look much like a person who died last year. They become unmoving, fixed landmarks, a phenomenon that has created one of the deepest ethical dilemmas in the history of mountaineering. The body of the deceased, a private marker of grief for a family back home, is transformed into a public, grisly waypoint for the next generation of ambitious climbers. Chapter 2. The First Ghost, George Mallory and the 1924 Mystery. To find the oldest human remains visible on Everest, we must travel back in time to the very genesis of the Everest legend, 1924. This is the story of George Mallory, the original ghost of the North Face, whose body remains the most preserved testament to the mountain's enduring secrecy. Mallory, a British mountaineer and veteran of the Somme, was part of the third British expedition to Everest. He was a man of intense philosophical drive, immortalised by his famous reply when asked why he wanted to climb the mountain: because it's there. He and his young climbing partner, Andrew "Sandy" Irvine, set out for the summit on June 8, 1924, from their highest camp at 26,800 feet. They were last sighted moving with considerable alacrity by a teammate, Noel Odell, disappearing into the mist just hours below the summit. They were never seen alive again. Their disappearance sparked the single greatest mystery in mountaineering history. did Mallory and Irvine reach the summit nearly 3 decades before Tenzing Norgay and Sir Edmund Hillary's successful 1953 ascent. The debate hinges entirely on the evidence found decades later, including Mallory's remarkably preserved body. The British expeditions of the 1920s were not mere sporting events. They were deeply rooted in a post-World War I national desire for dominance and restoration. The loss of a generation of young men in the trenches had left a void, and conquering Everest, the third pole, the last great geographical prize, was seen as a chance to reclaim global leadership and prove the indomitable spirit of the British Empire. This immense political and public pressure weighed heavily on Mallory. His personal drive was matched by the expectation of a nation. The equipment deficit was severe. The 1924 team was climbing with primitive gear. Their clothing consisted of wool, silk and tweed, offering minimal insulation compared to modern synthetic down. Their rudimentary oxygen system was unreliable, heavy and leaked constantly. We can infer that the commitment to succeed, despite equipment that was medically inadequate for sustained life above 8,000 metres, was driven by a sense of historical imperative. The climb was effectively a patriotic sacrifice waiting to happen. The discovery of the white body and forensic detail. 75 years later, in 1999, an expedition specifically organised to solve the mystery located George Mallory. He was found at 26,760 feet on the north face, lying face down on a slope of frozen scree. The preservation of the body was breathtaking and chilling. It was described as being in a state of almost perfect preservation, frozen and bleached by the sun and wind, its skin like alabaster. Mallory was fused to the mountain, his upper body welded to the ice. His clothes, though shredded in places, were still on his body, and his possessions were intact. The discovery provided immediate, harrowing answers about his death. His right leg was severely broken, compound fracture of the tibia and fibula, consistent with a massive, high-speed fall. His neck showed signs of trauma, and there was a serious puncture wound to his forehead, implying his final descent ended violently against a jagged rock outcrop. We can infer that his death was not instantaneous, but involved a prolonged, terrifying slide down the mountain, conscious and in appalling pain, before succumbing to hypothermia and the final fatal impact. The mystery of the missing camera and the final hour. The ultimate prize sought by the 1999 team was the vest pocket Kodak camera Mallory was known to have carried. Experts believed that if the camera had been encased in ice, the film might be salvageable. If developed, the film could potentially contain the summit photos, but the camera was missing. The items found on Mallory were only tantalising clues. His wallet contained letters, a pocket knife and an altimeter, but the photograph of his wife, Ruth, which he had promised to leave at the summit, was nowhere to be found. His snow goggles were found in his pocket, suggesting he was descending after dark, or in low light, potentially after a late summit push. The fact that the goggles were in his pocket and not on his face suggests he was attempting to descend after the sun had set and the light had completely failed. A fatal decision indicating extreme exhaustion and a desperate rush against the clock. The missing photograph and the missing camera are the definitive pieces of the enduring puzzle. If he reached the summit, he would have left the photograph there. The fact that the photo was missing suggests the possibility that he had achieved his goal and had died on the descent. If he had failed to summit, he would have retained the photo. Speculation on the final descent. Forensic examination of the rope marks on Mallory's waist suggests he was roped to Irvine when the fall occurred. The compound fracture of the lower leg indicates a high-velocity impact, likely when the rope went taut against a rock. We can construct a terrifying scenario. Mallory and Irvine were descending after a summit push, with or without success. Exhausted and caught in the failing light, they slipped. Mallory suffered the catastrophic leg injury and the head trauma. Irvine, unable to hold the fall, was either pulled over the edge himself or cut the rope to save his own life. A moment of tragic, desperate survival. The location of Mallory's body, far below the last sighting, confirms the violence of the final moments. The subsequent search for Irvine, believed to have carried the camera, has yielded only fragments, including a detached boot and foot bearing the inscription AC Irvine. Yet the bulk of Irvine's body and the camera remains swallowed by the ice, leaving Mallory as the mountain's oldest, best preserved and most enduring ghost. His silent corpse, discovered 75 years after his last breath, is the physical embodiment of the mountain's power to preserve both flesh and mystery. His body remains where it was found, reinterred under rocks, a silent grave on the north face, confirming the chilling precedent. Once the mountain claims you, it holds you forever. Chapter 3. The Physiology of Freezing, an Irreversible Process. The reason the bodies remain is not simply the cold, it is the specific, irreversible manner in which the cold kills and subsequently transforms the human body into an unmanageable, toxic block of frozen mass. This process is a detailed, multi-stage physiological nightmare that begins the moment the core temperature drops below 35 degrees Celsius, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Stage 1. Mild hypothermia occurs at 35 degrees Celsius to 32 degrees Celsius. This is the initial, insidious stage of the kill. The body, desperately trying to save itself, initiates maximum vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels in the extremities, hands, feet, nose, ears. This conserves heat for the core organs. The cognitive trap is immediate. The climber experiences severe shivering and a sense of cold, but their judgment begins to waver. They might struggle with complex tasks, like fixing a stove or calculating oxygen consumption. This is the last critical window for self-rescue, but the hypoxic brain often miscalculates the severity of the danger. The fine motor breakdown is rapid. The dexterity needed for clipping safety lines, managing zipper pulls, or operating carabiners rapidly vanishes. We can infer that many fatal mistakes, such as fumbling a glove or failing to secure a rope, occur precisely during this stage, as the hands lose coordination and the mind dismisses the urgency. Frostbite begins. With circulation restricted, the extremities are already freezing. The damage is initially superficial, but the continuous exposure at extreme altitude guarantees that by the time the climber reaches Camp of 4, they may have already incurred permanent catastrophic tissue loss in fingers and toes. The severe pain often masks the underlying terminal core cooling. Stage 2. Moderate hypothermia from 32 degrees Celsius to 28 degrees Celsius. The body's primary defense, shivering, ceases entirely as the heat regulatory center in the brain fails. The victim appears calm, but this is a terminal sign. The unseen killer, bradycardia, is underway. The heart rate drops dramatically, bradycardia. The metabolic rate slows, mimicking the state of a hibernating animal. This cessation of shivering and slow pulse gives the illusion of stability, trapping any potential rescuer into believing the victim is merely resting. Terminal confusion sets in. The climber suffers complete memory loss, disorientation, and slurred speech, dysarthria. This is often the point where haste is fully realised, leading to irrational acts like stripping off clothes, paradoxical undressing, often leaving the body highly exposed for the next stage of freezing. This is the critical point of no return for rescue, as the person is incapable of assisting in their own recovery, turning them into pure dead weight for the remaining team. Stage 3. Severe hypothermia, which is below 28 degrees Celsius. Death is imminent. the core. Organs are shutting down, unable to function at such low temperatures. Ventricular fibrillation occurs. The heart becomes highly unstable and is prone to ventricular fibrillation, a disorganized electrical chaos that causes the heart to twitch uselessly instead of pumping blood. This is often the final moment of death. Cellular crystallization begins. At the cellular level, the water inside the cells begins to crystallize, causing ice shards to pierce and rupture the cell membranes. This cellular destruction is the physical process that turns the human body into a rigid, non-pliable block. We can infer that this pervasive cellular damage is what makes the frozen body so fragile, yet so incredibly difficult to move. The tissue has become brittle biological glass. Preservation is complete. The body then transitions into its preserved state. The remaining fluid turns to solid ice, fusing the body to the surrounding rock and ice. This fusion is literal. The fabric, skin and surrounding water are chemically bound by the extreme cold, demanding immense force and extreme risk to separate. The body is no longer a human being. It is a fixed, complex part of the mountain structure. This physical reality, combined with the extreme hazard of working at low oxygen, definitively explains the initial abandonment. The rescue window is gone long before the body is even found. Chapter 4. The Killing Descent, Anatomy of Failure. The climb to the summit of Everest is often romanticised as the ultimate human triumph. However, the true brutal anatomy of a fatal climb reveals that the danger is not in reaching the top, but in attempting to leave it. The chilling statistic dictates the narrative. Approximately 80% of fatalities on Everest occur during the descent. To understand why so many bodies are left during the return journey, we must dissect the moments immediately following the summit. The moment when triumph turns into tragedy. The false finish line. The summit clock. The summit itself is an environmental trap. Climbers arrive after pushing for 12 to 18 continuous hours in the death zone, surviving only on bottled oxygen and pure will. The body is in an extreme state of catabolism, meaning it is actively consuming its own muscle, fat and organs just to function. Most summit bids begin around midnight and aim to reach the top by noon. This provides a critical turnaround time of no later than 2 o'clock p.m, dictated by the safety window required to descend several thousand feet before the deadly combination of darkness, plunging temperatures and high winds sets in. Psychological danger is overwhelming. Having sacrificed everything, money, safety, family, to reach that final point, the brain, already clouded by hypoxia, struggles to accept the need to turn back if the summit clock is reached. We can infer that many fatal decisions are rooted in the brain's complete denial of reality, fueled by the intoxicating proximity of the goal. The desire for the summit overrides the primitive, life-saving instinct of retreat, the onset of irreversible exhaustion. The descent requires a completely different type of physical and mental energy. While the ascent relies on a sustained burn of adrenaline and anticipation, the descent demands meticulous, controlled and precise motor skills, all while the body is deeply malnourished and depleted. Motor failure is common. The physical exertion of the climb has depleted the body's glycogen stores entirely. The descent is a struggle against gravity, where every step is painful. Cramps, muscle spasms, and the inability to maintain grip on ropes are common. A stumble that would be minor at sea level can result in a catastrophic, unrecoverable fall thousands of feet down the mountain. Oxygen deprivation. Fatigue is systemic. The body's demand for oxygen on the descent, while lower than the ascent, still far outstrips supply, especially if oxygen bottles are running low. Extreme fatigue is not just tiredness, it is the systemic failure of the central nervous system. Climbers often resort to simply sitting down for a moment of rest, a decision that is almost always fatal, as the cold quickly overcomes them, inducing the final, irreversible stage of hypothermia. The case of Sleeping Beauty, Francis Arsentiev, encapsulates the horror of descent exhaustion. In 1998, Francis Arsentiev became the first American woman to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. She and her husband, Sergei, summited very late, forcing them to descend in the dark. They ran out of oxygen on the descent, becoming separated. Francis collapsed, exhibiting symptoms of hypo and severe exhaustion. The final vigil was prolonged. Over the next 48 hours, she was found still conscious but immobile by various passing teams. A team of climbers named Woodall and Viestas spent hours with her, finding her in a state of terminal hypothermia, but alive. They were forced to leave her due to their own safety being compromised, a decision Woodall would later describe as the darkest moment of his life. Francis Arsentiev froze to death where she lay, eventually leading Woodall to return in 2007, 9 years later, to lower her body out of sight, fulfilling the promise he made to her as he left her to die. Her story is the definitive illustration of how fatal exhaustion and ethical abandonment are inseparable in the death zone. The cold on Everest does more than just preserve the body, it preserves the precise moment of failure. The contorted posture, the hand reaching for a mask, the eyes wide open in the final moments. The mountain freezes the tableau of death exactly as it occurred. These silent, frozen figures stand as perpetual reminders to every climber. The summit is only halfway. The ultimate enemy is not the height, but the exhaustion that turns a quick rest into an eternal, icy tomb. This reality is the first layer of the answer to the question, why are they left? Because to stop and help is often to join them. Chapter 5, The Tragic Markers, Green Boots and the Human Trail. Among the dozens of unrecovered bodies on Mount Everest, one figure achieved a tragic, macabre fame that lasted for nearly 2 decades. Green Boots. This specific corpse became the most visible, notorious, and morally challenging mile marker on the entire North Face route, directly embodying the dilemma of life and death in the death zone. The climber known as Green Boots is widely believed to be Tsewang Palja, a member of a 3-man Indian team from the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, ITBP, who perished during the catastrophic 1996 Everest disaster. The name was derived from the distinguishing feature of the corpse, a brightly coloured, neon green pair of Koflak mountaineering boots. The resting place and the 1996 disaster Palja and his team were caught in the infamous storm that decimated climbing teams from both the north and south sides of the mountain in May 1996, a disaster famously chronicled in Into Thin Air. Palja's body came to rest curled up inside a shallow limestone alcove, a small cave at roughly 27,887 feet, 8,500 metres on the northeast ridge. His position was unintentionally strategic. The alcove provided just enough shelter from the relentless wind to offer a temporary rest stop for descending climbers. Over the years, Green Boots became an undeniable, terrifying fixture of the North Ridge. Every single climber attempting the North Face summit had to pass this cave, often stopping briefly to use the small alcove as a brief shelter to change oxygen bottles or rest. They would step over or around the frozen body of Tsewang Palja. The transformation of a human being into a landmark is chilling. Green Boots served as a definitive geographical marker. Climbers would say, "We passed Green Boots at 800 am, or "We'll bivouac just above Green Boots cave." His frozen remains were stripped of identity and turned into a function of the mountain's topography. This process of dehumanization is a necessary cognitive mechanism for the living to continue their ascent. The mountain demands that human beings be categorized either as assets like Sherpas, climbing partners, or obstacles like corpses. The constant physical proximity to death erodes the psychological barrier against abandonment, creating a culture of morbid normalization in the high camps, the psychological effect of the sentinel. The prolonged visibility of green boots created a distinct psychological phenomenon among climbers. The normalization of death as an expectation. Unlike bodies lost in crevasses, green boots lay in the fetal position, visible year after year. Cognitive dissonance is powerful. For incoming climbers, the sight of the preserved body serves as the ultimate visual deterrent. However, we can infer that the brain, under extreme hypoxic stress, resolves this dissonance by rationalizing the failure. That person failed. I will not. Green boots becomes a statistical anomaly, not a personal threat. The peak immunity concept is real. This psychological defense mechanism suggests that once a climber has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars and months of training, the brain grants a temporary, irrational sense of peak immunity, the belief that the fate of the deceased applies only to others, not to themselves. This is fueled by the haste-induced ego inflation. The body of green boots, therefore, becomes a feature of the landscape, no more significant than a fixed rope or a discarded oxygen canister. The David Sharp controversy, the ethical low point. The most devastating ethical footnote to the story of green boots occurred in 2006, highlighting the absolute collapse of the social contract in the death zone. That year, British mountaineer David Sharp found himself in Green Boots Cave. He was found huddled next to the frozen body of Paljaw, alive but succumbing to hypothermia and severe exhaustion. Sharp had attempted a solo climb with minimal oxygen and no radio support, a clear violation of basic safety protocol. Over the course of the following day, approximately 40 climbers from various expeditions passed by David Sharp. Many noticed him, spoke to him, and attempted minor assistance, but the vast majority continued their ascent toward the summit, leaving the dying man behind. Specific climber accounts and the calculus of abandonment detailed the horror. Some of the first climbers passed Sharp in the dark, mistaking him for the long-dead green boots. Others realized he was alive but assessed his condition, immobile, suffering severe frostbite, and deeply hypoxic, as beyond saving without risking the entire team. They continued their climb, knowing they would have another chance to help on the descent. The Mark Inglis controversy brought the debate into the public eye. New Zealand double amputee climber Mark Inglis admitted to passing Sharp on the ascent. Inglis stated his team radioed their base, seeking advice, but ultimately continued toward the summit. The defence was stark. Moving Sharp would have required hours, consuming the team's remaining oxygen and ensuring their own death. Inglis further stated that at that altitude, the reality is that the victim is beyond saving. The cruel dialogue was later reported. Accounts emerged of Sherpa guides trying to move Sharp, but finding him too frozen and heavy. In his hypoxic state, Sharp could only weakly wave off assistance, possibly confusing his rescuers for hallucinations, or simply too far gone to communicate his distress. Sir Edmund Hillary's condemnation was final. The controversy drew widespread public condemnation, including from Everest pioneer Sir Edmund Hillary, who expressed indignation, stating that abandoning a climber in distress was totally wrong, and that the goal of getting to the top had become too divorced from basic human compassion. The tragedy confirmed the grim reality. The mountain demands absolute self-reliance. This terrible circumstance forces us to acknowledge that the presence of the dead actively normalizes the proximity of death, lowering the moral barrier against abandoning the dying. Green Boots, as an eternal sentinel, created a psychological blind spot that may have contributed to another man's death years later. In 2014, in a quiet act of respect, and perhaps commercial necessity, to clean up the route, a Chinese expedition managed to move the body of Green Boots to a less conspicuous location. But for years, his frozen form served as the ultimate heartbreaking metaphor for the brutal calculus of survival on Mount Everest, the ultimate cost of summit fever. Chapter 6. The Southern Tragedy, Hannelore Schmatz and the Open Eyes. While the North Face had Green Boots, the classic Southeast Ridge route, pioneered by Hillary and Norgay, was guarded for 2 decades by an equally famous, equally chilling figure, Hannelore Schmatz. Her story is a profound meditation on the thin line between marital triumph and ultimate tragedy, and her corpse became a defining landmark of the South Colonel Hannelore Schmatz, was a German mountaineer who in 1979 was part of an expedition led by her husband, Gerhard Schmatz. At the time, Gerhard became the oldest person to summit Everest at the age of 50. Hannelore, defying initial plans and pushing through deteriorating weather, also successfully reached the summit, becoming the 4th woman in history to do so. The historical context of the 1979 expedition. The 1979 expedition was not a commercial venture. It was a small, high-stakes personal undertaking by the Schmatz couple. This context amplifies the tragedy. They were experienced climbers seeking a record, but their mission lacked the huge support teams and fixed ropes of later decades. This limited infrastructure meant that when disaster struck, rescue was truly impossible. The conditions on their descent were atrocious. They were caught in an unforecasted, rapid shift in weather, a terrifying phenomenon on Everest where clear skies can turn into a deadly blizzard in minutes. They spent an unauthorized second night above Camp 4. We can infer that their desperate decision to stop was driven by the total, unavoidable onset of terminal exhaustion and a severe drop in visibility, making continued descent a guaranteed fall, the fatal rest, and the final words. The triumph quickly dissolved into disaster on the descent. The weather worsened dramatically. Hannelore, severely exhausted, and her American companion, Ray Jeanette, were urged by their Sherpa guides not to stop, but to keep pushing down to the relative safety of Camp 4. But exhaustion, fueled by raging hypoxia, won. They decided to bivouac at approximately 28,000 feet, 8,500 metres, deep within the death zone. The decision proved fatal. Ray Jeanette succumbed to hypothermia and exposure that very night. Hannelore, distraught and severely weakened, continued her descent the next morning, accompanied by a Sherpa guide. At approximately 27,200 feet, 8,300 metres, just 330 feet above Camp 4, Hannelore collapsed. Her final, desperate words, whispered to the guide, were, "Water, water." She died shortly thereafter, collapsing into a seated position. The Sherpa guide, Sungdare Sherpa, remained with her for a period, attempting to help, but was forced to continue his descent, suffering catastrophic frostbite that resulted in the loss of most of his fingers and toes. The cost of compassion, even in a failed rescue attempt, was absolute. For years, Hannelore Schmatz's body was a visible, disturbing spectacle for every climber on the south route. Her remains froze solid in the position she died, sitting upright, leaning against her backpack, with her eyes wide open, and her blonde hair whipping violently in the gale-force winds. The mummification process for Hannelore was particularly gruesome. Because she died in a seated, upright position, the fluids were preserved in a way that left her facial features eerily intact. Climbers who passed her often recounted the shock of seeing her open eyes, which appeared to stare blankly at the sky. This particular aspect of preservation added a layer of psychological terror that green boots, curled up and largely obscured, did not possess. Her corpse became a symbol of wide-eyed failure for every climber passing between Camp 4 and Camp V. The Schmatz case highlights the ethical challenge of visible remains. Hannelore's body was not just a reminder of danger, it was an object of theft. In 1980, her husband, Gerhard, later found that Hannelore's Leica camera, which she had carried during the ascent, had been stolen and sold by a local vendor in Kathmandu. This shocking discovery confirms the terrible reality that even the dead are not immune from exploitation on Everest, a sign of the deep moral compromise the mountain demands. The specific theft of a personal item, a trophy from the dead, epitomizes the complete breakdown of respect that occurs when life is cheap and opportunity is scarce. This act is a mirror reflection of the abandonment itself, a final callous appropriation of the victim's humanity. The mute testimony of failure remains. The visible nature of Hannelore's body led to early attempts at retrieval. In 1984, two climbers, Yosuke Sakai and Pasang Nima, attempted to bring her down, hoping to provide closure for her family. This humanitarian mission ended in its own tragedy. Both men were killed during a storm while attempting the recovery, proving the mountain's sovereignty once again. The recovery of Hannelore Schmatz now carried the cost of 3 lives, guaranteeing the permanency of her resting place. Unlike green boots, Hannelore's body was eventually claimed by the mountain itself. Around 1984, fierce winds, possibly aided by an unidentified climber cutting her securing rope, finally dislodged her. She was blown over the edge of the Kangshung face, sliding into the deep crevasses below, where she was finally swallowed by the glacier, resting out of sight. While her disappearance brought a small measure of relief to the climbing community and her family, her story remains the most visceral account of how the mountain preserves its dead in a state of terrifying, wide-eyed vigil. Chapter 7. The Shadow Economy, Sherpas, Debt and Disaster. Insurance. The fundamental mystery of abandonment is not just a failure of physics, it is a failure of economics and political will. The burden of death on Everest falls disproportionately on the Sherpa community, the indigenous, high-altitude workers who risk their lives for Western clients. Their deaths, often unrecovered, expose a brutal shadow economy where life is cheap and the insurance system is designed to fail. The cycle of debt and risk. The average Sherpa works on Everest primarily to lift his family out of crushing poverty. The income from a single climbing season, up to $5,000 to $8,000 for a senior guide, can represent 10 times the average annual income in Nepal. This is a powerful motivator, but it ties them directly to the risk. The gear debt is substantial. Sherpas often take out loans to buy essential climbing gear, like down suits, boots, axes, which can cost several $1,000s. If they die early in the season, this debt immediately transfers to their family, often compounded by local loan sharks or community pressure. The risk multiplier is 12-fold. Sherpas often perform multiple highly dangerous tasks, fixing ropes, carrying heavy loads, and retrieving bodies, all within the death zone. This exposure means that a Sherpa is statistically 12 times more likely to die on the mountain than a Western client. The vast majority of the anonymous bodies left behind are those of Sherpas, whose families lack the international connections or funding to retrieve them. The insurance scam, minimal payout for maximum risk. The Nepali government, recognizing the inherent danger, mandates that Western expeditions purchase life insurance for Sherpa staff. However, the system is fundamentally flawed and morally bankrupt. Minimal coverage is mandatory. The mandatory life insurance payout is typically around $15,000 to $20,000. This is a pittance compared to the average Western life insurance policy, and critically, it is often barely enough to cover the family's existing gear debt, let alone provide long-term financial security for the children. This minimal coverage ensures the family receives only a token payment, rather than true financial security, effectively valuing the high-altitude labour at its cheapest possible rate. The retrieval failure is systemic. The retrieval cost of $75,000 to $100,000 is completely separate from the life insurance. The life insurance policy does not cover recovery, placing the full financial burden for retrieval squarely on the bereaved family, a burden they cannot possibly afford. This financial firewall ensures that the client's commercial interest is protected, while the Sherpa's body is abandoned due to cost, reinforcing a deep economic disparity in death. The helicopter politics and rescue fraud. Adding another layer of corruption to the shadow economy is the dark history of helicopter rescue fraud. While helicopters are critical for medical evacuations below Camp 2, the financial incentives have led to systemic abuse. Unnecessary evacuations are common. Expedition companies, sometimes in collusion with helicopter pilots and medical clinics, have been known to organise unnecessary rescue flights, often over-insuring clients and claiming minor altitude sickness as critical emergencies. The cost of a helicopter evacuation can exceed $20,000, and the difference between the actual flight cost and the insurance claim often feeds the pockets of corrupt operators. The failure of high-altitude helicopters is constant. Even with modern technology, helicopters cannot safely operate or hover above Camp 4. This physical limitation means that while the shadow economy profits from low-altitude fraud, the critical problem, retrieval from the death zone, remains unaffected and impossible, as the real victims lie too high for intervention. The technology serves profit, not rescue, political and ethical complicity. The Nepali government, which derives massive revenue from climbing permits, which can be upwards of $11,000 per foreign climber, is complicit in the system by setting minimal insurance standards and failing to fund comprehensive, state-led recovery operations. We can infer that the government prioritises the flow of tourist dollars over the safety and dignity of the local workers. When a high-profile Western client dies, the international pressure often results in funds being raised for a retrieval mission. When a Sherpa dies, the body is usually left, or simply buried in the snow near where he fell, due to the immediate financial barrier. The mountain reveals the exact market value of a human life, which is drastically different depending on the passport carried. The silent, exposed bodies on Everest are not just victims of the cold, they are victims of a globalised economic system that values Western ambition over indigenous life. Chapter 8. The Logistics of Death. The 3-tonnage problem. The central mystery, why are the bodies left, is answered by a harsh calculus governed by gravity, altitude and money. The core problem is logistical. Summarised best as the 3-tonnage problem, the efforts required to lift a single frozen body is equivalent to the maximum workload of 3 to 5 healthy Sherpa guides. The weight multiplier, frozen inertia and rigging. At sea level, a recovery team can manage an average 180-pound body relatively easily. On Mount Everest, above 8,000 metres, that body weight is multiplied exponentially by the extreme environment. Hypoxia versus load shows the disparity. In the death zone, the ability of a human being to exert effort drops to roughly 25% of their sea level capacity. A climber capable of carrying 50 kilograms or 110 pounds at base camp can safely carry perhaps 13 kilograms or 28 pounds at 8,500 meters. Every action is magnified. The frozen mass is unyielding. A body on Everest is not pliable. It is frozen solid, often fused to the rock or ice. It becomes a massive, rigid, inert block of biological ice, weighing substantially more than a living person due to accumulated rime and ice. The body cannot be bent, strapped easily, or carried over the shoulder. Retrieval teams must often chip the remains out of their frozen resting place, a grueling, time-consuming process that requires specialised tools. The mechanics of retrieval: high-angle industrial engineering. Recovery requires specialised high-angle rigging and technical expertise far beyond standard mountaineering. The operation is more akin to industrial engineering than a traditional climb. The retrieval teams require specialisation. A standard retrieval mission requires a minimum of 6 highly specialised Sherpa guides working in rotating teams of 3. One team is constantly focused on rigging, one is focused on oxygen management and support, and one is dedicated to the manual labour of breaking the body free. The litter, sled and securing the mass is the most dangerous task. The body must be secured into a rigid SKD stretcher or specialised rescue sled. This often requires chipping the frozen limbs free from the surrounding ice, a task that demands precise force while the Sherpas themselves are operating on near fatal levels of oxygen. This is done with heavy metal tools, ice axes and chisels, which are cumbersome at altitude, adding immense strain. The recovery crew must often secure the body with ropes and carabiners, the metal screeching against the ice before any lifting can begin. Mechanical advantage is necessary. Retrieving a frozen body from a steep slope involves setting up complex mechanical advantage systems like 3-to-1 or 5-to-1 haul systems using multiple pulleys and fixed lines. This is complex, precise engineering that must be executed by Sherpas, whose hands are often numb and whose brains are hypoxic, increasing the inherent danger exponentially. This meticulous rigging and testing alone can consume half a day's oxygen supply. The retrieval operation is less climbing and more industrial engineering under impossible conditions. The descent is slow and controlled. It is a foot-by-foot lowering operation, requiring 1 Sherpa to manage the brake system, 2 to manage the guide ropes to prevent the rigid body from swinging into the void, and 2 to manage the transfer points where the ropes must be unclipped and reclipped across the fixed lines. It is a slow, methodical burn of finite oxygen and energy. The cost barrier: oxygen, insurance, and the financial nightmare. The manpower requirement immediately translates into an astronomical financial cost, which is the second pillar of the abandonment mystery. Every Sherpa involved in the retrieval operation requires supplemental oxygen, which is essential to prevent their own death. A full retrieval operation requires personnel cost is immense. 4 to 6 highly experienced Sherpa guides. Their hazard pay for a multi-day mission, starting in the death zone, is immensely high, reflecting the risk. Oxygen cost is non-trivial. Each Sherpa needs between 8 and 12 litres of oxygen per minute for the high altitude portion of the mission. The cost to purchase, transport, and utilise this quantity of oxygen is a substantial percentage of the budget. Logistics and permits must be purchased. This includes specialised equipment like litters, extra ropes, high altitude camping supplies for the recovery team, and paying for the specialised permit for the removal. The estimated cost of retrieving a single body from above Camp 4 currently ranges from $75,000 to $100,000. In 2017, the recovery of one body cost the financiers over $90,000. The insurance deficit is real. Every climber who ascends the high peaks in Nepal is legally required to carry insurance to cover the cost of their own rescue and recovery. However, this regulation is often inconsistently enforced. and even when enforced, standard policies often cap retrieval coverage far below the six-figure cost required for a death zone body retrieval. We can interpret this as the insurance industry itself acknowledging the financial impracticality of the mission. This massive financial barrier ensures that, in the most literal sense, the bodies are left behind, because the cost of bringing them home is deemed too high, a stark and tragic reflection of the commercialised brutality of modern mountaineering. Chapter 9. The Unseen Graves, Khumbu, Icefall, and the Great Faces. While the narrative often focuses on the handful of famous visible corpses, the green boots, the sleeping beauty figures, the grim reality is that the vast majority of Everest's deceased are not visible at all. They are entombed in an unseen shifting cemetery of ice, swallowed by the mountain's greatest hazards. We must assume that for every body lying exposed on the main routes, there are 10 more lost to the mountain's terrifying geology. The Khumbu, Icefall, the unstable graveyard. The single most dangerous section of the standard south route is the Khumbu Icefall, located above base camp between 17,000 and 20,000 feet. This is a chaotic river of ice, moving several feet a day, a constantly collapsing, churning labyrinth of massive seracs, ice towers, and deep crevasses. The icefall is responsible for the single largest number of Sherpa fatalities. When a climber or Sherpa falls into a crevasse, a deep fissure that can drop hundreds of feet into the blue ice, the body is immediately encased and then pulled down and shifted by the constant movement of the glacier. The dynamics of the glacial tomb are complex. The Khumbu Glacier is not static. It flows at a rate of several feet per day, especially in the warmest hours. This movement means that the position of any body lost in a crevasse or beneath a serac is constantly shifting. The location where a climber vanishes one morning will be structurally different by evening. This flow guarantees that once a body is swallowed, its recovery location becomes mathematically impossible to predict, as it is encased in a dynamic continental mass. Crevasse mechanics are unforgiving. A fall into a crevasse is a plunge into a blue ice world. The body is often wedged by the narrowing ice walls or lands on a snow bridge at the bottom. Retrieval from a deep crevasse is virtually impossible. The ice walls are unstable, and the immense weight of the ice above means any effort to dig or retrieve risks, triggering a massive collapse. A body falling into the Khumbu Icefall is immediately resigned to its fate as an eternal, frozen relic, destined to be slowly moved by the glacier for decades before potentially reappearing, shredded near base camp, miles from the original site of death. The serac threat is constant. The icefall is defined by its seracs, massive, unstable towers of ice, some the size of apartment blocks, that shear off unpredictably. The crushing force of a serac collapse instantly obliterates and buries anything beneath it, sealing the victim under thousands of tons of compressed snow and ice. This type of death is common, sudden, and offers zero chance of recovery, transforming the icefall into a perpetual lottery of geological hazard. The psychological burden on the icefall doctors, the specialised Sherpa team that fixes the routes, is immense. They constantly work among the active, shifting graves, knowing that any day a collapsed serac could add them to the mountain's unseen inventory. The Great Faces and the Avalanches. Most of the over 200 missing bodies are located not on the gentle slopes of the ridges, but on the steep, unforgiving faces, the Lhotse face, the Kangshung face, and the sheer drop of the north face. The Lhotse face is a nearly 4,000-foot wall of steep, unrelenting blue ice. Bodies lost here often slide or are swept down into the deep, hidden crevasses at the base of the mountain, the Lhotse wall, ensuring they are sealed away. The Kangshung face is the mountain's wildest, most remote and avalanche-prone side. Climbers lost here are generally swept over the massive vertical drops into the vast, inaccessible valley below. Hannelore Schmatz's final descent over the Kangshung face is a perfect example. Once she was dislodged, her remains were lost to the abyss, out of sight forever. The velocity achieved during these falls ensures the body is often fragmented beyond recognizable form before coming to its final rest, the psychological impact of the unseen dead. The unseen dead pose a different kind of ethical and emotional challenge than the highly visible markers. Perpetual ambiguity is the result. For families of the unseen dead, there is no finality, no location to mourn. The climber is classified as missing, presumed dead. This perpetual ambiguity is emotionally devastating, preventing the closure afforded by a retrieved or even a visually identified unrecovered body. We can infer that this lack of evidence fuels the desperate fundraising efforts for searches that are almost certainly futile. The mystery of location is eternal. The absence of a physical body transforms the deceased into an eternal part of the mountain's mystery. The Khumbu Icefall, with its shifting, chaotic nature, becomes a permanent metaphor for the trauma and uncertainty of loss. The mountain itself becomes a living entity that constantly hides and reveals its secrets, ensuring the names and stories of the vanished endure in the form of geographical questions. Where did he land? Is she still in the crevasse? The geological reality confirms the ethical answer. The problem is not merely moving a body. The problem is that the majority of bodies are simply inaccessible. They are either crushed beneath unstable, moving ice, or lie thousands of feet down a sheer slope, where any attempt at retrieval would require a team of specialised workers, risking certain death. Not for a rescue, but for a recovery. This landscape of shifting crevasses and unyielding ice is the true, vast and silent cemetery of Mount Everest. Chapter 10. The clean-up campaigns and the cost of closure. The problem of the exposed bodies did not truly enter the global consciousness until the early 2000s, when increased commercial traffic made the presence of corpses, like green boots, unavoidable. This led to organised retrieval efforts, characterised by immense cost, high risk, and an unsettling focus on route aesthetics as much as family closure. The narrative shifted from mourning individual loss to managing a growing environmental and commercial problem. The political and public health justification for removal. Initially, the consensus among traditional mountaineers was that a body should be left where it fell, entombed in honour by the mountain itself. However, the rise of commercial guiding and the sight of hundreds of climbers queuing past visible remains forced a pragmatic, less romantic perspective. The arguments for removal crystallised around two non-negotiable needs. Public health crisis contamination became a priority. While the extreme cold preserves bodies, it does not guarantee sterility. Above Camp 4, teams often melt snow and ice from the surrounding area for drinking water. The proximity of human remains to these water sources presents a genuine, though rarely discussed, public health hazard. As the surface ice thaws during the climbing season, there is a risk of biological waste and pathogens entering the water supply used by high-altitude camps. The argument shifted from respect to risk management, asserting that removing the bodies was necessary to protect the living from contamination. Commercial imperatives, safety and aesthetics drove action. The exposed corpses became a major bottleneck and public relations disaster. Green Boots Cave, being a mandatory rest, caused traffic jams on the North Ridge. A fatigued climber spending extra time navigating around a body risks hypothermia or haze. Expedition companies began lobbying for cleanup, recognising that the visible dead were the ultimate liability. both for physical safety and for their brand image. The mountain's image as an aspirational destination was being undermined by its reputation as an open-air graveyard. The cost breakdown, the financial wall, in detail. To truly appreciate why these bodies are abandoned, we must look past the simple danger and examine the brutal accounting. This is a cold financial reality where the value of a human life is measured in tons of equipment and litres of oxygen. The estimated cost of retrieving a single body from above Camp 4, the point of no return, is staggering. It ranges from $75,000 to $100,000. This massive price tag is justified by 4 non-negotiable cost elements, each representing a percentage of the total mission budget. First, the largest expense, accounting for 40 to 50% of the total cost, is high-altitude labour. This isn't just about paying guides. This is about paying 4 to 6 expert Sherpas, extreme hazard, pay for 3 to 5 days of the most dangerous work on Earth. Their pay is high because the risk of them dying or suffering permanent injury during the retrieval is immense. It's a massive, guaranteed risk of premium. Second, making up another 25 to 30% of the budget is the cost of oxygen and logistics. We're talking about 15 to 20 specialised oxygen cylinders. Not just the cost of the gas, but the exponential cost of getting that cylinder hauled mile by mile up to the death zone. This is a literal life support debt the mission must pay up front. Third, demanding 10 to 15% of the budget is specialised equipment. This isn't climbing gear, this is rescue equipment. This includes high-angle rigging, specialised rigid rescue sleds known as litters, winches, anchors and chiselling equipment necessary to physically break the frozen remains free from the ice. Finally, the remaining 10 to 15% is dedicated to permits, administration and transport. This covers the mandatory government permits for body removal and the incredibly expensive cost of the final helicopter sling load, that delicate operation where a specialised helicopter risks its maximum flight ceiling just to lift the rigid remains from Camp 2 to base camp. The high failure rate and the focus on moving bodies off the main route versus repatriation underscores this cost. The mountain makes altruism economically impossible. Unofficial relocation, the hidden graves. The official cleanup campaigns of the 21st century were preceded by decades of unofficial, ad hoc relocation. When a body lay directly on the climbing line, expedition teams often made the unilateral decision to move the remains, driven by necessity and a desire to avoid the psychological impact on their clients. The burial method was often employed. Most often, these bodies were simply moved a short distance and buried under a cairn, a pile of stones, or rolled over the nearest cliff edge. This was done without proper coordination or documentation. While these actions were taken to restore dignity, they created new problems. They obscured the remains, making future retrieval by the family impossible, and potentially increased the danger by moving unstable masses of ice. The Francis Arsentiev mission proved the cost of ethics. The 2007 mission, led by climber Jake Woodall, to retrieve Francis Arsentiev, Sleeping Beauty, was a highly publicised attempt to correct a perceived ethical failure. Woodall, who had promised Arsentiev he would return for her, did not repatriate the body. Instead, he and his team lowered her remains from the trail and covered her in an American flag, effectively moving her off the immediate path, an act of respectful relocation rather than true recovery. This mission cost tens of thousands of dollars, demonstrating that even a purely ethical, non-commercial move requires a prohibitive financial commitment. The success of the official campaigns remains limited. They can only target bodies that are easily accessible and relatively close to the main route. The vast majority of the over 200 remaining deceased, those buried in crevasses or lying thousands of feet off route, remain untouched, proving that even with state funding and specialised teams, the logistical difficulty of the death zone is the definitive, unbeatable barrier. The cleanup is a partial solution, not a final answer, serving as a heartbreaking symbol of the enormous, non-negotiable cost of closure. Chapter 11. The Future of the Tomb, Climate Change and Legacy. The legacy of the bodies on Mount Everest is a profound and unsettling one. They serve not merely as grim warnings, but as the ultimate physical manifestation of the mountain's enduring power, a power that transcends human ambition, ethics, and even death itself. The mystery of why they are left is solved by a triad of facts: logistical impossibility, prohibitive financial cost, and the ethical imperative of self-preservation. Everest remains the ultimate equalizer, the place where social status, wealth, and nationality dissolve under the merciless weight of physics. The frozen corpses, the anonymous and the famous, the Sherpa and the Western millionaire are all reduced to the same inert, preserved mass. The unstoppable thaw, glacial retreat and re-exhumation. Looking ahead, the fate of the remaining bodies faces a new, unpredictable variable: climate change. As global temperatures rise, the glaciers on Everest are thinning and receding at an accelerated rate. Scientific studies indicate that the ice melt at near base camp is occurring faster than previously recorded. This glacial retreat is creating profound and unsettling challenges. Exposure and degradation are accelerating. Bodies that have been entombed in ice for decades are beginning to thaw and reappear near the surface. These remains are often highly degraded or fragmented as the process of decomposition, autolysis, and putrefaction, previously halted by the deep freeze, rapidly restarts upon exposure to warmer temperatures. This creates a heartbreaking dilemma for local authorities. They must now deal with decomposing, unrecognisable remains rather than preserved mummies. The south versus north divide in melt rates is visible. The impact of thawing is different across the mountain. On the South Nepali side, where the Khumbu icefall is dynamic and the sun exposure is high, the instability and melt are most pronounced. On the North Tibetan Chinese side, the environment is drier and colder, leading to slightly slower degradation, but increased risk of exposure as high winds scrape snow from the ridges. We can infer that the Khumbu icefall will become a recurring source of grim discoveries in the coming decades, pulling long-lost climbers out of the ice. The legal crisis of re-exhumation is imminent. The reappearance of bodies encased for decades creates complex legal and emotional crises for the families who thought they had achieved finality. Legally, the Nepalese authorities now face the challenge of identifying and transporting decomposing remains. Emotionally, families are forced to relive the initial trauma of loss decades later, confronting the remains of a loved one that are often unrecognisable. This unintended re-exhumation by climate change transforms the mountain from a silent tomb into a dynamic, unpredictable witness. The ethical challenge of sovereignty and data. The future of the Everest dead presents a new ethical challenge concerning ownership and data. Sovereignty is untested. Who has the right to decide the fate of the bodies that thaw? The family who paid for the original expedition? The Nepali government, which owns the mountain? Or the climbing community, which uses the routes? The lack of clear international law on extreme high altitude remains means each case is handled ad hoc, often relying on the local Sherpa community's judgment. DNA and identification is a possibility, The thawing bodies offer a unique opportunity for identification through modern DNA technology. This could potentially solve cold cases from the 1970s and 1980s. However, it requires a massive, coordinated effort to collect, preserve, and catalogue the degraded biological material, a forensic project that currently falls far outside the budget and mission of the commercial expeditions. The thawing Everest forces a confrontation with the failure of human systems to deal with the mountain's sovereignty. The mountain's ultimate act may be to return its prisoners to the world that abandoned them, demanding a final comprehensive accounting that is currently beyond the world's financial and ethical will. Chapter 12. The Final Accounting. Sovereignty, Ethics and the Unpayable Debt. We have explored the physics, the finances, and the philosophical compromises that define the graveyard of Mount Everest. The mystery of why they remain has been definitively solved. The logistics are impossible, the cost is prohibitive, and the ethical code is designed for survival, not rescue. Yet the final lingering question is what the silent sentinels truly represent to humanity, the market value of life and death. The entire tragedy of the unrecovered dead is distilled into a single, devastating economic truth. The market value of a human life is drastically inverted on Mount Everest. The cost of ascent is clear. A foreign climber pays up to $100,000 for the chance to summit. This cost purchases a life in motion, oxygen, Sherpa support, and the chance at glory. The cost of repatriation is a brutal addition. The same climber, once dead, requires a minimum of $75,000 to $100,000 to be brought back. This is the cost of a life at rest. The mountain effectively doubles the price of the life, charging a final, mandatory fee simply to surrender the body. The Sherpa disparity is morally grotesque. For the Sherpa, the most experienced and endangered worker on the mountain, the cost disparity is morally grotesque. Their mandatory insurance policy offers minimal compensation upon death, while the cost to retrieve their body far exceeds that entire payout. This system guarantees that the Sherpa remains, overwhelmingly, the most likely body to be left permanently on the slopes, cementing the ethical bankruptcy of the modern climbing industry. The mountain exposes the ultimate limit of capitalism. Money can buy ambition, technology, and risk mitigation, but it cannot buy escape from the physical laws of altitude, nor can it guarantee the final dignity of a burial, the sovereignty of the mountain. The lasting legacy of the unrecovered dead is a philosophical one, the assertion of the mountain's absolute sovereignty. Everest is a deity that claims ownership of its dead. It preserves them, transforms them, and uses them as cautionary tales for the next generation of aspirants. Every climber who steps over the frozen remains of Green Boots is receiving a final, non-negotiable briefing on the true nature of the mountain. The human will is finite, but the mountain's power is eternal. The silence of the 200-plus bodies is not a passive acceptance of their fate. It is the mountain's active, frozen declaration of dominance. The greatest mystery on Everest is not who died, or why, but why humanity continues to test a realm that offers no negotiation, demands total sacrifice, and holds the final, terrifying authority over the human body. The silent sentinels remain, frozen in the act of climbing, forever reminding the living that the highest place on earth is also the most unforgiving final resting place. You've now traversed the entire length of the death zone and back, exploring the deepest mystery of the mountain's human cost. If you want to explore another mystery, subscribe and comment what cases you want to learn about.